Hello, I'm Joseph. I wanted to share a story or an experience you may have when working with C interop with Zig. That's getting C libraries into Zig so that you can use it. Just to give you a little precursor here, this is libssh2 that I'm going to be showing you integrated into Zig itself. This is a C library compiled as a static library that I'm including for Mac OS. I've also got this to work on Windows as well. Talk about that in a little bit. And so, yeah, the first thing that I will say there's this kind of variable that you just give it. It could be any variable name, doesn't have to be C, and then you do C, add import as a comp time function, and then you include the functions. You can't have custom defines, which coming from C is like a macro, and you can add that in for any of the requirements of the header itself to do any particular maybe statements or flags it needs to also come across. You can also pass that through command line, but this is just nice to have a conditional in Zig itself. It's more readable in this context. Really cool. The first little gotcha with this though, and by the way, like in Rust, you have a separate build command to do the bridging, build gen if I'm not mistaken, and then Swift you have a completely separate project you will do with a like a weirdly abstracted configuration file to get all this stuff to work. With Zig, you just include the header. I really like that. But the first thing I ran into has to do with the autocomplete feature from ZLS, or the language server protocol, LSP. And so when I type in C dot whatever, I don't get any information on this, even though it can compile, which means it's generating a subsequent file from this, which I'll talk about later as well. It doesn't work. The other thing I tried to do was, okay, well, maybe if I just do a relative include. So this is a path here, libssh2 slash include. And I'm going to go ahead and write this, and I'm going to go ahead and build it just in case. So we're going to do run shell command make build. This will go ahead and build it. And now, if I go ahead and type in C dot whatever, I still can't get autocomplete information. Okay, well, maybe if I do this and delete this here, and then I go ahead and run the same make build, builds out properly. Now, do I get anything to autocomplete with? No. So the only way I've been able to get it like work around this is to include the absolute path, which I don't enjoy doing, but I don't really have much of a choice here. So I'm going to go ahead and include my current working directory, and then go ahead and write this. And we're going to go ahead and do one more build. Should work fine. And we'll do C dot. Sorry, let me do this here. C dot, and then I can do libssh2 session init, and I can get function information, like typed parameters if I wanted to. Really cool. So very helpful in terms of getting the stuff out there. You're not having to build out a separate bridging file to get this information into Zig itself. It does this all automatically, which is really nice. Okay, now after you do this, you may start using some of the functions. You're like, why is it complaining at me at something that I don't quite understand? Like the first one I ran into was the actually session init feature function, which is a C define. So if I go and actually look for this real quick here, path. What in the world? Why is this not finding it? Let's try this again. Paste that in. There we go. Okay. So it's a define, which is a it's a macro, and it's an alias to this function. Now in C, you could have just technically done like inline void or inline void whatever crop and just actually do that, and the compiler should be able to inline that. But unfortunately, most libraries will do something like this. They'll do some bullshit where Zig may or may not be able to do this correctly. So if I go ahead and actually uncomment the implementation of that, and I try to go ahead and run the build command, you'll see that I actually get an error saying, hey, we're looking for this type of pointer, but you gave us this pointer here. And it's just null. Even though I can pass it in manually with null in Zig itself, Zig does some handling around null to correctly cast it in the background, but it does not do that when you're having C Translate do that for you with a wrapper that should have not been translated in the first place, because technically Zig doesn't really do very well with macros at all. Okay, so that's like one example of one function. I had this happen about two more other times, so you can see these here are also having issues. One of them actually has a compile error, so if I try to call it, it'll throw that error at compile time, saying that it doesn't know what to do about this because these string literals it can't correctly convert from the C version to Zig itself. Um, that is mostly the surface stuff that you're going to be running into. There's other like minor things. So this library is different than it is on Windows for Mac. They have different parameters for functions. And so I was using the POSIX layer that Zig has for socket implementation, which is fine, but the socket implementation is different per platform. So on Windows, it gives you a pointer. On Linux and Mac, it gives you an integer to work with. And the problem with that is the actual implementation of the handshake. Oh, geez, man. Handshake. What in the world? There you go. It requires an integer. So I have to cast the pointer to an integer, and then it also requires an integer for Linux and Mac OS, but it just needs to be casted as a different integer, and it can handle that casting because it already knows the type it needs to cast it to. But you need to be explicitly casting it in Zig because Zig is very, very explicit on everything it does. It's not trying to hide anything from you, so it will cast the int to the int it needs, which is a u long long on Windows, and I think a u int or sorry, an int on Mac and Linux. Uh, that is really all I had an issue with. Everything else has been kind of fairly smooth sailing, with the exception that compiling libssh2 on Windows was an absolute effing nightmare. MSVC ABI, I hate with the passion. I hate not only the compiler but the ABI in general. Trying to target stuff with it. I'm gonna show you this real quick. Um, I have an app build bat, and how am I supposed to know these flags that I am supposed to pass in? Um, I understand the target is MSVC, but then to know that I also need to include the the MSVC include path, okay, maybe, but the Windows SDK for Windows 10 and higher, like this stuff it sucks. To work with because I'm going through what you would do in Visual Studio 2022 into a Zig's command line stuff, which is an abstraction around Clang as well. Sometimes you need to get through this to get to Clang to also pass in additional flags. I'll show you an even uglier version of all this stuff. But here is my build command for debug and my build command for release small. And by the way, I can do a static build under a megabyte for this libssh, being able to have the full feature set of SSH with SFTP. It's really, really awesome to have that there for that. And I'll actually show you a quick demonstration of that here. So I'm gonna go ahead and quit out here, quit all, and then actually I may, let's see, I have a open SSH server set up through Docker. So I'm gonna do Docker compose d just to make sure it's running, and then I'm gonna go ahead and run my build command. And I forgot to fix the init issue, so let me go back to main and then go to init for this here, and we're gonna comment this out and comment this back, right quit, and then do another build. This will connect to that dummy server. It will then run like through the parameters it was passed through, port 222 on 127 using test user and test pass as a password. I haven't programmed anything about certificates yet. And then yeah, it does this and then parses it out in Zig. So I don't know. It's really, really cool that I can do this in Zig, and it works on Windows too. So normally with Windows, there's no SSH stuff built into like mounting it as a drive or something like that. You do have SSH built into PowerShell now, but it's nice that you can actually build out a full program with libssh underneath the hood of all this stuff. But The part I wanted to show you was actually the README part, which was I was doing this stuff with mbed TLS, which is the encryption layer that libssh2 used, but on Windows specifically, I couldn't get that to work because while you can compile it with CMake, and this is all the CMake commands on Windows, by the way. What it was doing was it was having all these missing functions that it could not implement on Windows. Therefore, I opted to then just use right here I'm using mbed TLS for Windows. I had to use the WinCNG, the built-in encryption features that Windows has and ships with Windows Vista or higher. Um, and while it makes it a lot easier to compile now, I wasn't fighting trying to manually link all this crap together with custom flags. It just wasn't a very enjoyable process using all this stuff. Like, again, you need to go figure all this crap out in order to get it to build correctly for that. Anyways, this is the easier story. It's the light path you're going to go through. It's the best experience you're going to have in Zig, I think, for us, fairly straightforward. Unless it's prepackaged already, like Raylib Zig is a great project. If you want to use Raylib, you want to program a game, you're okay with using a game library or framework and not specifically game engine. You kind of like just let do whatever you want with it. They have cross compiling already pre-set up. They have WASM support already enabled. They have just a PowerShell or a Bash script you would run to set up everything for you, so you have to manually modify the build.zig or the Zon file itself. Now, with that, I'm going to get into the most ugliest thing that you can probably be running into, the hardest time that you're going to have using a C project into Zig itself. And for that, I need to go ahead and open this up. So to give you some context, PHP is a language. It is one used for the web, and you mostly just use C or C++. And the reason why is that many of the calls that you do, so if I do go to extension2.c here, all these, not this here, but all this stuff here that you call, these are all macros. This is not even valid C code. Like if I go to this definition here, it is, I can't go to the macro because it's not gonna be able to find it, but this is a macro that generates a C function. It is not a C function that generates a C function. It is a macro. It is an expansion of a string, and you pass in the function, kind of function name that you want to give it. This is all like so riddled with so many problems. I hate this in that PHP internals does this. It makes it so difficult to use any other programming other than C or C++. Rust has a variant of this. They have to I think they rewrite a lot of all this stuff by hand. And that's exactly what I'm doing, but I'm trying to keep as much of the C nomenclature as it is for Zig. So I actually have that same bit of code here. If I open it up, ext Zig, and I go to some of these test functions here. So Zig test, here, this is that same code that you saw before that were all macros, but now it's all verbose. It is exactly what you would expect to see if you're writing this in C in the first place, with all these macros involved here. And I do have their macros, but I have to re-implement their macros because they are not the easiest to get around. They require quite a bit of setup here for some of this stuff, and specific implementation details for like parameter parsing that is all wrapped in macros. Like if I was programming this, if I wanted to write like a Python extension in Zig, it's all just functions. If Node.js, all just functions. Lua, all just functions. But in PHP specifically, it's all flipping macros. I'm going absolutely flipping bananas doing all this stuff. And it gets worse because Zig's translate is riddled with bugs that will, because all this is macros, it's creating C code. This C code is being translated from C to Zig via C translate or C imports, which is both the same thing. I had to my first step was just to go ahead and patch some of the C code, the internals of the PHP, to get around some of this stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my patch file here. This is an example of a patch for the atomics, another patch for a double return that C translate will find, which will do, but then when it compiles to Zig, from Zig to like a binary, it will complain about. So it creates code that it can't even compile itself, and a bunch of other stuff. This is a light thing to expect, where you really do need to go change the C code because Zig can't really work with it as is for that library. Then you would get to a point where it translates it, but it's inline. like it's an inline function. This shouldn't be in the actual header that you're including. None of the stuff should be in the header you're including, but like libssh, it's going to have inline functions. They do this for performance, and it's not very fun, but it's expected. It will create these magical bugs for you, though, for some of these inline things because it's not a perfect C to Zig compiler. Now, to give you a little bit of a taste here, there is a feature in the command line called C translate. You could put any of the C code that you want, and you can get out the Zig code. So if you're a C programmer and you want to learn Zig, this is a good way to start. Now you do have to include the everything that's needed for the header, the C code that you're writing, but you can put, once you do that, you just include that and it's fine. It'll figure it out. But the next thing is to wrap some of the functions. So in let me see, it was in the extension itself, I had a slash inits as well. Slash inits. It was like string allocate. So there is a string allocate function. Let me see if I can go ahead, actually go to this definition. I cannot, so we'll go ahead and try to global search for it. So here, this is the implementation of it in C. When Zig gets to this and tries to translate it, it does it incorrectly and it will create a memory corruption, or it will throw an error, a runtime error, because it's trying to do a like null terminated string, but it doesn't have the length to work with it, and so it throws like a length issue. But there's some other ones that where it will literally corrupt the memory because it's doing the wrong code that is in C to Zig code variants. So yeah, basically I go in here. Let me see if I can go back to the thing here. Oops. Go to the wrapper itself. I have to wrap the function I want it to call in C and not have Zig touch it. And the way I do that is by putting it into wrapper.c, wrapper.h, or whatever you want to call it, and I compile this as an object file. So for example, if I open up wrapper.powershell, I used Clang that is inside of Zig. So I do Zig Clang with all the little arguments, and I generate a wrapper.o or object file. Then what I do from that is I go from my object file into my build command, and then I wrapper.o goes into my my build, my final build. So my Zig binary build lib, and then I toss in that object file, which was compiled completely outside of my Zig library. So it is impossible for it to take that C code. And I do have wrapper.h, which is included in Zig, but it's no implementation details. It's just here's a declaration of it. That's all you need to know. You don't need to get all this other stuff. And you can see that I'm doing some weird other crap here too, which gets to my final thing. So you can go modify the C code. You can go make a wrapper file. The last bit was that on Windows specifically, and this is an issue with how the C translate process works, is that let me go to emalloc here. So I got to search for underscore emalloc. It needs to call in php underscore emalloc this is like the base thing. It's an external function, so it's not implemented in C import, but it needs to be declared as external in the C import file. If you're not quite sure what I'm talking about, that was everything I was talking about here generates a C import file. So I don't think I can actually get to it right now, but you kind of get the idea. This is like a baseline function that has to be properly decoded in the C import because it's the fundamental thing that's used everywhere. There is no bit of it that it cannot be incorrectly used. So that string alloc stuff uses zen malloc, which is is this here. This was another one that just didn't, like, it's just like all over the place on these core functions. So what was happening was on Windows specifically, any bit of memory that was allocated at the PHP runtime, because these were supposed to be external functions. These are not implemented in the C import. They're not using Zig code. They're using the PHP runtime. It would create all these memory corruption issues because the type definition in Zig was completely wrong. And I've tried everything. The only thing that I found that was to work was to pass in C++ flags for MSVC, because it seems like it need to use the C++ version rather than C version to compile the C code correctly. And so that little stick has caused a massive disrupt. So I had to then do exactly what I previously had shown, the expand thing here, and expand out all the C headers for the PHP extensions into a php.c file here. And by the way, all this was fun to figure out exactly everything that I needed to get into this. And then it goes out into a php.c, like I said. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the file, php.c, and that's what we just saw here. But it is a massively long file of a bunch of C code. But this means and I now forgo every possible define that could have been translated by Zig to no longer being translated to Zig. So then I had to subsequently go and in my ext2 file, I use this as a base reference to import everything, and then I define all of my constants that I need because they are actually defines in PHP's header files. So if I take this and I search for this, let's see, can we do this? Can we go from here to there? This HED? No. Okay. So let's do this again. Let's go to type info here. So all of these here, all of this is no longer being translated from Zig, because Zig, when I do my expand from C to then to go to Zig, all of this is now destroyed. It's gone. It's deleted because there's nothing using it that's assigned to anything. These defines don't mean anything when you do a C expand via clang-e. So I had to set them as variables, and I can't name it the same variable because then it'll be re-expanded twice. So you'll see like is reference equals to is reference. It's not very enjoyable. And I already had to do a lot, and I do mean a lot of already existing stuff here. So hash, for example, a bunch of these macros that these are functions. These are literally functions. But in the, let me try to go to this one here if I can stop scrolling all over the place. If I search for this here and I go to the hash, this is the macro in C. Who in the holy world would want to ever work with the PHP internals and wish upon themselves to have to work with all this? Because like you don't even know the types of what this macro takes. It's not a function, and it's a incomplete do statement. It starts a do statement and doesn't finish it. In fact, it does a for loop and doesn't finish the for loop either. And I had to reprogram all of this because Zig could already not do this, but I have to do this myself. And this is like the worst end of a project that you're going to get to, is that you have to reprogram these macros. You have to go maybe possibly made a wrapper file, go make C source code changes to the original source code that you're including, and then using that to custom compile a variant that will work for you and Zig itself. And then on top of that, the very last part is to do your own C expansion, losing all macro possibility and rewriting every other macros by hand, and going through that. So that's where I'm gonna leave it there. It could be an enjoyable process. It could be a very minor little journey for you, or it could be the complete hellhole that I'm showing for this specific project to get Zig to be able to write a PHP extension.